All right, so this is the turbo introduction for our 65 millimeter turbocharger for our Generation 2 L5P. That's your 2024 plus models. So what I got in front of me right here, this is the factory center section off the Gen 2 L5P. You can see they have a 70 by 61 millimeter 10 blade turbine in them. That's a little bit different than the 70 by 60 millimeter 11 blade that was in the 17 to 23 L5P. So quite a bit different. Something else that's different about it is the vane cage actually, this vane cage actually indexes in a pattern aligned right to this intersection. So you see these 3 alignment pins there, it actually indexes to the center. The older turbochargers, the vane cage was indexed and aligned to the exhaust housing, which was always a problem for us because we'd break studs off and stuff like that, just little dowel alignment pins. So that's what the turbine looks like. It's not a bad flowing turbine, it's just kind of small for the cubic inches of the L5P. And then this is what we did. So we designed and came up with a different turbine. It's also a 10 blade. It is a 78 by 72. So this is the inducer, this is the exducer. Where the factory had it's roughly a 10 millimeter wide vane right here. We went to a 12 millimeter wide vane right here. So the vanes, nozzle width all the way across the turbine sits at 12 millimeters. This allows us to put more mechanical leverage on the turbine, and then a larger exducer allows us to get more of the exhaust energy outside of the compressor housing, and then allows us to drive this turbine a little bit harder, or quite a bit harder in fact. So pretty good for drive pressure. The idea was to keep drive and boost in check the best that we could. So if we go to the compressor side of both of these turbos, you can see that the factory, just like the previous generation, the factory is a 61.3 by 84 millimeter compressor. They also use a large shoulder here and then an external nut that fastens the compressor to the thrust bearing inside the center section. So this is very similar to the 17 to 23. The only difference is right here, you can see those tips are actually extended. A little bit different design than the older compressors. This radius here is a little bit different as well. So what we did, because we don't really prefer those single plane compressors that have 11 blades on one plane, we went to a 7x7 with an 11 degree back swept vane from the center point. So if you see this is 7 blades with 7 splitters, these are also point milled. You can see those marks that are inside there, those are all point millings. And then you can also see that we went to the fastener being part of the compressor itself. So the fastener and the compressor are one component, just like all of our turbos for the L5P. I think we're the only company that does that. The reason that we do this is when we component balance or slow speed balance these compressors, we are balancing the whole thing as a rotating assembly. So we know that they're perfect. And then when we bolt this down and tighten it onto the center section, we know that there's no external nut that would move or dislodge or change its orientation to knock this compressor off balance. So it makes it a lot easier, and point milling makes things a lot stronger. The back swept blade design keeps the compressor from going into surge as easily compared to the single plane compressor that the OEM uses. And if you could see, the OEM has quite a few marks on it for balancing, where we don't have to put so many marks on our compressor because the nut itself is part of the rotating assembly. You'll see one mark here where we remove some material for balancing, but that's pretty much it. So that's the way that the compressors work. And then when it comes to weight, and everybody asks this stuff all the time, this is the factory compressor. So you would have the factory compressor, and then you would have an external nut. So we'll weigh them, and then the nut, we're 148 grams. And ours, since we don't have an external nut, it's quite a bit bigger. Ours is 144 grams. So the two compressors themselves are a lot different. You can see how drastically different the compressors themselves look. Significantly larger in size. Again, 65 by 92. This is 61.3 by the 84 millimeter range. And then if we move into the the cages themselves. So this is the factory cage. This is probably the biggest problem. The factory cage at 10 millimeters is pretty restrictive. If I were to pull the cage out, there's typically a 10-pound differential pressure right across the cage, just by the fact that you got nozzles in there. They can only open up so far. If I go to our cage, this is designed to fit the compressor or the turbine that we have. You can see our nozzles open up the same exact distance, but they're larger overall. They're 12 millimeters wide. 12 millimeters, a little bit longer. The cage itself is bigger to accept that bigger turbine. And if you put them side by side, you can see there's a drastic difference between the two. Just overall cage size. So pretty impactful. So the last thing that GM did, and they continued with this, is they run a map groove inside their compressor section. So you can see this is the compressor cover, which is different than the older compressors. The older compressors had the big actuator up here. These compressor housings, if you look at them, they have these 3 slots that are in here, and then inside there's this groove, and this groove is called a map groove. And this map groove, if I flip the compressor over, you can see that groove allows air to flow back into the front side of the compressor to re-energize the center section of the compressor. So the idea is to keep the turbo out of surge. That's the idea behind the map groove. And because that's there, and we can't really change that without recasting something completely different, it requires some sort of a shroud. That's why the factory has an intake air horn that has a shroud piece in here. Our new turbochargers will have the requirement to have a shroud in here, so this will fit right down in there. And then you can see there's this gap that allows air to come back out of the map groove and then right through this slot and then re-energize and repressurize the volute area of the turbocharger. So again, they will have to have a shroud. All of them should have a shroud and not just an open hole design. And those are kind of the key differences. Again, we cover the turbine, we cover the vane cages, we cover the differences in the compressors, and we cover the difference in the 2 center sections. And one thing that we did a little bit different in our center is we put a little more robust journal bearing and thrust bearing arrangement in here. The thrust bearing takes all the weight of the compressor and the turbine trying to meet each other on the inside of this because of the drive pressure differences. So we did put a better thrust bearing set in here, thrust bearing and thrust backer plate. But that covers the Gen 2 L5P 65/72 millimeter turbos from us that are coming to a market near you. All right, guys, here's some of the dyno plots off of our 2025 Gen 2 L5P. So this is the OEM baseline horsepower number. We got 415 horsepower, and you can see that's in that like 2,800 RPM range, 2,900 RPM range. Really couldn't get anything more out of it than that. And then we swapped to our turbocharger, the 65/72 millimeter turbo. We got a peak power of 690 horsepower and 1,288 foot-pounds of torque. And that horsepower is coming in a little bit later at like that 3,000 RPM mark. And then we turned the power down a little bit and we were at 674. So we're not at 700, but it's just slightly under 700 horsepower with our turbocharger mounted.